Welcome back to Taiwan Outlook. Joining us today is Dr. and Professor Rumelin. He's the chairperson for political theory and philosophy at University of Munich, Germany. Professor, we've been talking about the cultural foundation for democracy. But as we know that leaders in China has been saying that, we have a very unique culture. The so-called Western concept of democracy doesn't fit with the Chinese culture. Do you buy that argument?
No, I don't. Look, China develops for the moment a market economy. Mm-hmm. One could say, well, market economy is something which does not fit to our culture. Mm-hmm. I would even say market economy is a form of extreme individualism. I'm not one of those who think this is the essence of a democratic or Western society. I even think that a pure market economy destroys community values, destroys the values of family, destroys the value of tradition, and of historical embeddedness. So I think the state has to organize a frame, a lawful frame, that also restricts market economy.
Yeah.
For example, it's necessary that we organize state institutions that look for solidarity. Organized solidarity. Without organized solidarity, so a mere market system, market capitalist system, would be disastrous for the social relations. So if there is a tension, this tension is between a more or less free market capitalism. And what's interesting is that those who say, well, in Asia there is a certain tradition of community value, of communities in general, of family, Confucianism plays certainly a role, and the long history of solidarity within regional groups. Well, then I would say, well, restrict capitalism. This would be an interesting objective for this new emerging biggest, maybe soon biggest economy in the world. What I see is different. There is lots of mobility in China. There is inequality. One of the top, most equal distributions in the world. It's in Gini coefficient. If you look to the Gini coefficient, which, that measures inequality, China is on the top global, worldwide. So there is a certain tension. And I would say, if community values are so important for the Asian culture, what I believe is true, then the state should be more active in restricting capitalist markets. But democracy is compatible with community values.
But one country seems to be doing okay in balancing the so-called free market economy and the authoritarian nature of its political system. That is Singapore. Do you think Singapore is a good example of balancing the two?
Well, I once only in my life was in Singapore for, I think, 10 hours or something. So one night or 2 nights in Singapore some years ago. So I can't really judge. Singapore is a special example because also it's a multi-ethnic society with one group, I think 60%, and other groups, Malayans and European and Indian groups. So it's especially difficult to organize a democracy there, that's for sure. On the other hand, Singapore has every condition fulfilled to develop a modern form of democracy. One might add, in such a situation, one might add certain minority rights that make sure that not one ethnic group dominates the rest. This is a very important and difficult task. But I don't think that Singapore would lose its economic strength in changing the system to democracy.
Okay. In terms of human rights, China has been arguing that, the basic human rights for China now is to feed them, Short of that, it's okay. In the long run, we may move towards the so-called better human rights, but now, feed the people. Do you think that's a correct answer to the questions about China's human rights records?
Well, the human rights, there is a long discussion worldwide now. After the Second World War, it began, and even before, but after the Second World War, And that what some Western states took as human rights exclusively concentrated on individual liberties did not survive this process of discussion. So it was changed and especially added values and rights in the broader sense that are based on communities, social rights especially, and cultural rights. So we have this form of liberalist individual rights, first generation, then second political and social rights and cultural rights. So we have different forms of rights. And the result in the end was that almost every country in the world signed the conventions on human rights that the United Nations proposed. And I think there is no way out. If one accepts these, and one should accept it, because this is the result of a 2 or 3 decades discussion, and it's globally accepted, more or less. There's an overlapping consensus, so to say. Then one should also realize these human rights in the political system. And this means that, for example, everybody has equal fair treatment in law cases, that there is a controllable and public form of government, so that you know who decides on which issue, and that the public can form its own opinion about it, and then in the end elect these or those because they want to know which future they want to go in. So I do not see any incompatibility. If you accept human rights, one should also establish it in the form of the political regime.
One of your expertise is so-called politics and ethics. I think it's a very interesting topic for many viewers here. What's the relation between politics and ethics, especially between democracy and ethics?
Yeah, maybe I mentioned some of the key elements of this relation. As I said, freedom, equality, and solidarity seem to me the 3 main elements of democracy, and then a decision procedure that allows for getting rid of the government without civil war. But certainly there is also a cultural and ethical substance in democracy, because these equal respect is not just given if you stay to the rules of the law. It has to be part of the form of life everybody lives. So how do we treat somebody else with another, let's say, color of skin in the streets, and how do we communicate with persons of another culture? How do men and women interact with each other in their personal surroundings? So all this is part of a democratic culture. How do we grow up our children as personalities or as servants, and so on and so forth. So this kind of ethical orientation has to grow, and it takes a while. For example, what we realize for the moment is that many may be afraid what the future might bring, reorientate themselves to traditional groups, sometimes fundamentalist groups, and cutting themselves and their families off from the modern world and modern developments. And this is a dangerous development in my account. And so lived, real democracy needs a certain ethical basis.
Some people worry, especially in Taiwan, that democracy brings inefficiency. In a way, you also create some sort of corruption and so on, lobbying groups, interest groups, influencing the policies. How does ethics play into this kind of system?
Well, I think indeed one has to be very careful. If, for example, the media don't tell about political processes, only offer, let's say, shows and I don't know, entertainment and so on and so forth. And no real information. Then the broader public has no idea of what is going on in politics, and politicians can do whatever they like. Likewise, if there is no transparency, you don't know who pays for what decision, and then there evolve new dependencies of the political sphere, especially from the economic sphere, that can be very dangerous. So, for example, in Russia, this seemed to be one of the major problems of the young Russian democracy, and maybe it's in Taiwan a little bit similar, but I can't judge this really after this 1 week of stay here in Taiwan. So this is not only a threat to democracy, as everybody knows, also in dictatorships there's corruption. Yeah, so this is not a question between democracy and dictatorship. It's a question of transparency, of a certain ethics of the political sphere. For example, some politicians are afraid that problems they have would become apparent and discussed in public, but the political class itself has to be aware of corruption or the problem of corruption. So I think without a certain ethical basis regarding the politicians themselves, a good democracy can't work.
Do you see any democratization in reverse, you know, for instance, Russia and other parts of the world? Because we've been very proud of the so-called third-way democracies and democratization marching forward. But we've been seeing some setbacks in current years.
Yeah, well, some interpret the Russian development as a backfall, or how do you say, as some development in the wrong direction, so giving up democratic values. It's also very difficult to judge whether this is really true. I got the impression that under the Yeltsin regime, the influence of economically powerful men on the political sphere was much bigger than today. So it seems to me that in Russia, the state has been reconstructed, so to say, and the state institutions are stronger now than before, but maybe accompanied by a problematic development that one man, the president, and his allies more or less control or are in control of the whole political process. If this would be the result, this is certainly dangerous, but I think one should wait a little bit and look what happens also after the change of presidency.
How about you know, developments in Central and Latin America in general? Because we've been seeing democracy moving in a quite interesting way.
Yeah. Well, in Latin America, as far as I can see, there is presently no threat that democracy is given up again and military regimes are established. What you mean probably is the Venezuela example and some other left-wing politicians, but you have to see they are elected by the population in democratic, and it's still a democratic rule. Certainly there is always a danger, especially if they come in a situation in which they fear that an US-American intervention might change the government. But if the United States is careful and does not too much try to intervene in these political processes, I think this could be a form. Brazil is also more or less a left-wing presidency. It could be also a form of third world politics that shows here are the restriction of capitalist markets and we want to be in control of the development. So I wouldn't say from the beginning that this is a goodbye to democracy.
That's right. One of the U.S. government's policy, foreign policy, is the so-called expansion of democracy. They want to expand democracy to other countries. But some people criticize the U.S. for imposing U.S. values. Do you think that the U.S. is doing the right thing in exporting democracies to other countries?
To be frank, I think this strategy fails. And not only that, you can see the failing of the strategy in Iraq, it must fail for reasons that can easily be explained, and I sometimes wonder how it could ever be that such a big nation with so good scientists and advisors is so ill counseled as it seems to me. Look, there are some few examples. For example, Germany after the Second World War, and this was taken also to justify this imposition or export of democracy. They say, well, look, in Germany it worked, but Germany was a democracy before, even for not a very long time, 14 years. Yeah. It had a long cultural tradition towards a nation state, Kulturnation, cultural nation, and then it developed an own nation state, a highly educated population, and then, most importantly, maybe, the experience of a total disaster in domestic policy. So that's right. National Socialism was a total disaster. So the whole population said, well, this cannot be our future. We have to find something else. So we are open for a new way. But in all other cases, democracy has to be developed within the country, especially because there are these cultural backgrounds and cultural bases and prerequisites. Without it can't work. So this is a development, and it cannot be imposed from other countries, especially if there is such a cultural gap as between the Islamic region in the Near East and the Americans, US-American society. So, and then most have the impression it's not so much about exporting democracy, it's more about exporting economic goods or importing economic goods like oil. And so it's totally wrongly initiated. I think one can argue in favor of democracy, one can make international contracts in favor of democracy. We can, for example, try to get the consensus on social and ecological and also democratic human rights, minimal, let's say, thresholds that are necessary to be part of the international community, politically and economically. This would maybe foster international democracy. That's right. We can foster global civil society, so exchange of ideas, exchange of languages and of poets and so on and so forth. This all helps to develop as global civil society, and this would be a good basis for democracy, but not in with military means to export democracy.
Yeah, but Professor Fukuyama argued that it's the end of history, capitalism or democracy prevails. Yeah. So when we come back, we'll talk about the challenges that democracy has to face in the future. Let's take a short break. Stay with us.